Well, thank you so much for inviting me. Thanks to Jeff and thanks to Jim and fellow panelists. I normally begin a talk with a joke, but I worry that you might think the whole talk is a joke, so let me just say that I'm going to be completely serious from now on. And the issue here is democracy a human right? That's the issue we were asked to discuss, and we're also given a definition of democracy from Article 21 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which I'll read it here. The will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government. This will shall be expressed in periodic and genuine elections, which shall be held by universal and equal suffrage and by secret vote or by equivalent free voting procedures. Okay, so democracy here is political equality in the form of free and fair competitive elections, one person, one vote for the country's most powerful rulers. I'm just going to use that definition. We can call it electoral democracy. I think it's the most common definition in the West anyway. When you see it on the news, when people talk about democracy, that's what they mean. When Western governments try to promote democracy, that's usually what they mean. So I'm just, of course, there are many different definitions, but I'm just going to begin with what I think is perhaps the least controversial definition of democracy as some sort of electoral democracy, one person, one vote. Now, human rights, here I just mean that, what's the point of a human rights regime? And basically it's supposed to protect our basic humanity or the fundamental goods or needs or interests that underpin any reasonable conception of flourishing. But like Michael Ignatieff yesterday, there's a dispute over which goods are meant to be fundamental. Now, there's little public dispute about prohibitions over slavery, genocide, murder, prolonged arbitrary detention, systematic racial discrimination, and so on. I don't think we have to argue about those, because those rights have become part of customary international law, and they're not contested in the public rhetoric of the international arena. Of course, human rights violations occur all the time off the record, but in terms of, as a theorist, we don't have to argue about those rights. But is democracy in the form of elections a fundamental human good? I mean, do we have a fundamental interest in electoral democracy? And that's what I will question. And so the first we were asked to talk about the theory of this question, is democracy human rights, and then some of the practical issues, and finally some of the pedagogical issues. So let me go in that order. Now we know that in the West, it wasn't always the case that, I'm from Montreal, and I was, learned to think of democracy as something that's unquestionably good. Of course, you have to vote and choose your government, and it's one person, one vote. But we know it wasn't always that case. 19th century, John Stuart Mill, for example, thought that it's very important to try to choose a moral and intellectual elite, and that he thought of such means as giving extra votes for voters, for educated voters. But now we've come to think of democracy as a fundamental human good, and anyone who argues against democracy, to be honest, is thought to have lost his or her moral compass. I mean, I've made this argument a few times, and I think this means that I'm basically politically ineligible in Canada if ever I were to come back and try and campaign. All these arguments would mean that I'm somehow outside of the normal sphere of moral thinking. Of course, in China, it's not the case, right? This is a big issue. Is electoral democracy China's future? So let me begin the first issue as a theoretical issue. Is democracy a human right? And I think, of course, if you compare it to things like torture or genocide, I mean, of course, it's not. Many theorists have put forth some good arguments against electoral democracy, but nobody's going to argue, for genocide. Just to give you some recent arguments that have come out, there's a very good book by Brian Kaplan, The Myth of the Rational Voter. He's an economist, and he shows, based on very substantial empirical research, that most voters are systematically ill-informed. And he proposes tests of voter competence as a remedy. Now, in the US or Canada, it's a crazy idea. Nobody would propose tests of voter competence anymore. But again, in different contexts like China, that sort of idea might be taken more seriously. Another book by a philosopher called Jason Brennan, The Ethics of Voting, and he argues, look, what's the whole point of voting? You choose politicians who exercise power over people, not just over yourself. So when you vote, you have to be motivated by the common good. And if you're not motivated by the common good, if you vote strictly according to your own selfish interest, then you shouldn't vote. He argues this in a very persuasive way. Both books published by Princeton, they made a big waves and so on. But politically speaking, in the West, to be honest, I don't think they'll have much effect. In China, no, they're being translated and are being discussed. Anyway, in China, you have some Confucian thinkers. The most famous, perhaps, is Jiang Qing. But you have many others like Bai Tongdong and Joseph Chan and so on. And they argue that, look, electoral democracy, even when it works well, it's limited because ideally a political ruler should take into account of the interests of all those who are affected by the policies of government. But in an electoral democracy, the rulers, if it works well, they take into account of the interests of voters. The problem is that it's not just voters who are affected by the policies of government, right? It's future generations, it's ancestors, it's people living outside the state. This is a huge issue when it comes to, for example, global warming. You know, nobody, if there's a serious case of conflict between the interests of voters and the interests of non-voters who are affected by the policies of government, usually the interests of voters would have priority. There's no institutional mechanism in electoral democracies today to represent the interests of non-voters who are affected by the policies of government. So these thinkers, they argue, well, we need then a separate political institution that's where the rulers are selected by non-democratic means, like, for example, examinations or performance at lower levels of government, that would have the specific task of representing the interests of non-voters who are affected by the policies of government. Now, some of these thinkers argue that we should also have a democratic house, because they argue there's two sources of legitimacy. One is democratic legitimacy, and the other is a legitimacy based on competence and virtue. Which one should have priority really depends on whether you're a kind of strong meritocrat or a weak meritocrat, or a strong Democrat or a weak Democrat. So you have thinkers like Jiang Qing who argues that this non-democratic house should have a constitutional priority in cases of conflict. Now, of course, they know that this is a long way from the reality in China, but they think that these sorts of political ideals should serve as standards for evaluating progress and regress, that we shouldn't just use electoral democracy as a standard for judging reform. You know, I mean, if you watch the news in the West, typically speaking, when people talk about political reform, what they really mean is moving towards electoral democracy. But these thinkers are arguing that we shouldn't just use those sorts of standards. Okay. Now, what are the practical implications? Is democracy of human rights? If we agree that democracy is not a fundamental human right, what are the sorts of practical implications? Now, of course, I think many of us think that we shouldn't invade a country or use economic sanctions to promote electoral democracy. I mean, I realize that, you know, some thinkers do argue that we can, but I'm just going to assume that we shouldn't do that. Whereas we can do it to promote basic human rights, like a country that carries out genocide. If we can invade that country and save the people, yes, we should do it. I think, anyway, many Confucian thinkers would agree too. But the issue here is really, should we use moral pressure to promote electoral democracy? And here, I think, again, we need to be very, very cautious. And what are some of the reasons? The first reason is that electoral democracy can undermine human rights. I mean, the most famous arguments are proposed by Lee Kuan Yew, the former Prime Minister of Singapore, and also the Chinese Communist Party. And they argue that human beings have a fundamental interest or right not to live in conditions of severe material deprivation. So the main task of government should be to reduce poverty. And constraints on democracy are justified if they're necessary to accomplish this goal. Now, that's an empirical question. Is there a trade-off? And there's lots of empirical data showing that, especially at lower levels of economic development, there is a trade-off. If we agree, then here too, we should be cautious about using moral pressure to promote democracy. A related argument, that we need to be cautious about promoting democracy if we're unsure that democracy will lead to better protection of human rights. And what are the sorts of conditions that would make us, especially outsiders, more sure that democracy will lead to better protection of human rights? Let me list 4, and I think none of those conditions apply in the case of China. The first is that the target country is led by an outlaw regime that systematically violates human rights. Think of North Korea, you know, that would rather spend money on nuclear bombs than feeding its people. Not the case in China, okay? 2, you can confidently predict that rulers would lose elections and there is an obvious alternative. Now, in the case of Burma, obviously that condition was the case, and I've always argued in favor of promoting democracy in Burma, but in the case of China, it's not the case. 3, regime change is likely to improve the people's material well-being. Like Zimbabwe might be a good case where if we got rid of Mugabe, then perhaps the country would be better off from a material point of view. In China, it's not the case. Fourth, democratization won't be bad for minority groups, foreigners, and future generations. Now, again, it's not obvious that, for example, if you have democracy in China, you might have a stronger sense of nationalism, which might not be good for minority groups and foreigners and so on. So none of these conditions apply in China, in the case of China. But there's a more fundamental, long-term argument. How much time do I have? Okay, well, speaking fast. There's a more fundamental, long-term argument against democracy. And this is one that I'm going to pursue a bit now, because I've actually changed my mind on these issues, because I used to agree with the kind of Confucians that we should think of a political ideal model in a kind of horizontal sense, where there's one democratic house and one meritocratic house, and then how do we balance them is really the key issue. But I now think of a kind of horizontal model as more, a vertical model as more justified, where at the central level, there's a kind of more meritocratic mechanism to choose rulers, and at the local level, there's a more democratic mechanism to choose leaders. Now, why is that model a good idea? I mean, in China, we can call it the China model, and basically, this is an ideal model. It's not meant to necessarily describe the reality, but I think it's a model that has inspired political reform over the past 2 or 3 decades in China. So those who say there's been no political reform in China, I think that's wrong. It's only if you think of political reform as in an electoral sense. But if you think of this model, where you have meritocracy on top, democracy on the bottom, and experimentation between, that can be a morally justified alternative to electoral democracy in the sense of choosing the top leaders. Now, why is democracy at local levels of government a good thing? Well, at the local level, and in fact, there have been local level elections in China, right? Over 700 million people have participated in local level elections. Of course, many problems, but still, overall, you have had elections. Now, at the local level, people know the ability and the character of the people they choose, right? They're more well-informed, too, about local issues. Do you build a hospital or a school? Those issues, people understand them at the local level. And also, there's more of a sense of community at the local level. So people are more likely to vote in a public-spirited way. So for all these reasons, having democracy at local level is a good idea. At the central level, though, what I mean here is China, the central level, Beijing, it's a country of 1.3 billion people. The issues are much, much more complex. And it's very important for rulers to be chosen on the basis of superior ability and morality. You don't want somebody, who doesn't understand the basic facts about how the world works, or somebody who is corrupt. It doesn't. At the local level, corruption is a problem, but it's not a huge problem. But at the central level, it is a huge problem. It really goes to the heart of the system. So, since the early 1990s, China has been moving towards this kind of more meritocratic means of choosing leaders, where the rulers are selected by examinations. I mean, my colleague Wang knows, that our best students now often want to write these public service examinations, which are very rigorous, tons of competition, and then that's a door to serving in the government. And then you get promoted on the basis of performance at lower levels of government. And it's a very long process, decades long, and eventually to make it to the very top in the standing committee, you have to have been either a governor or a party secretary of a major province the size of most countries. Okay, of course it's highly imperfect, this model. We know especially that corruption is a huge problem, and it's more of a problem in a meritocracy than in a democracy. Why is that? Because in a democracy, we were just talking today with Jim, in a democracy, if a ruler is corrupt, well then the people can vote the ruler out of power, and if the rulers are still corrupt, then the rulers, the people, to a certain extent, need to blame themselves. But in a meritocracy, what gives legitimacy to the rulers is precisely the fact that they're supposed to have superior ability and virtue, and if they're corrupt, it really goes to the heart of the whole system. So that's why now, there's this life and death struggle against corruption in China, which isn't true at countries at similar levels of economic development to nearly the same extent. I mean, according to Transparency International, many democratic countries are more corrupt, India, Indonesia, Russia, and so on. But corruption isn't viewed as like a really life and death struggle in a way that it is in China. So the China model is highly imperfect, but, or to be a bit more optimistic, precisely because meritocracy is a source of legitimacy, we can predict that in 10 years' time, China will do a better job at dealing with corruption than democracies at similar levels of economic development. In any case, the basic point here is that the China model should serve, they have a good model, I think, and it should serve as a standard for evaluating political progress and regress, not just a pure electoral democracy at the top. One thing about, since I have a bit of time, just say one thing about Michael Ignatieff's talk yesterday, which I thought was wonderful. But he raised an issue about whether democratic states have more of a right to be wrong. I think to a certain extent that's true, but I think it's also true that meritocratic states have more of a right to be wrong. There's a big difference between North Korea and China. I mean, in China, the rulers are selected through much more meritocratic means. And that gives them a sort this competency, and it gives them a source of legitimacy. So I think we need to take more seriously, even if they don't do many things right, but when they do make mistakes, we need to give them a bit more leeway than we would countries like North Korea. So both countries are non-democratic at the top, but I think we need to do more to respect the decisions, mistaken or not, of the leaders in China. Now, what are the pedagogical implications? Well, I just have something very brief to say about this, that we need to distinguish between human rights and democracy when we teach about human rights. I mean, often we think of the two as all coming together. We want to promote human rights and democracy. Now, promoting human rights in the sense of, prohibitions against genocide obviously is important. And in China, often it won't use the language of human rights to make the same point, but you can often find the functional equivalents, and it's very important to have that debate over how to promote human rights, not just in countries, but in other countries. And now that China is a great power, obviously what it does affect other countries. It can't just insist on sovereignty in a way that it has the past 20 or 30 years, which... So China does have responsibilities, but what about promoting democracy? Well, this is where, I think it's basically, we need to be very cautious about saying that electoral democracy is the way to go. I mean, it seems so obvious in one sense, but on the other hand, it's not so obvious, because when you think of the Middle East, when all those regimes fell, we thought, well, what's going to take its place? Of course, some sort of electoral democracy. But I think in China, it's not at all the case. That's the only alternative in mind. I think this kind of China model is a better, or in the case, a better model. This Universal Declaration, Article 21.3 that I read at the beginning, maybe it should be either deleted from the declaration or rewritten. So I'll end with that. Thank you.